Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Deborah Kelvin learned very early that silence could be loud. In the small apartment she shared with her mother, silence wasn't peace, it was fear holding its breath. The walls were thin, the ceiling stained with old watermarks, and the heater only worked when it wanted to. Deborah was 5, small for her age, with wide observant eyes that missed nothing. She spent most mornings seated on the floor beside her mother's bed, arranging bottle caps into neat circles, pretending they were people attending a party where no one was sick and no one cried. Her mother, Ruth Nathan, watched her with a smile that took effort to maintain. Ruth had once been strong, the kind of woman whose presence steadied a room, but illness had hollowed her cheeks and slowed her steps. Deborah knew something was wrong, even though no one had explained it properly. Children sensed truth before they understood words. She knew her mother was fading, and she knew time was becoming something sharp and dangerous. Ruth Nathan had not planned this life. She had once worn crisp nursing uniforms, tied her hair neatly back, and walked hospital corridors with confidence and purpose. Caring for others had been her calling, her pride, and her shield against loneliness. Deborah's father had left before Deborah could form memories of him, leaving Ruth to rebuild her world around one fragile center. She worked double shifts when she could, skipped meals so Deborah wouldn't have to, and told herself exhaustion was temporary. But illness did not negotiate. When it came quietly, disguised as fatigue, then pain, then collapse. Now Ruth lay in bed more often than she stood, her breath sometimes shallow, her hands trembling when she reached for water. She feared many things, but the worst was the idea of Deborah waking up one day without her voice in the room. That fear haunted her nights and followed her into every waking hour. Across the city, far removed from peeling paint and unpaid bills, Timothy Charles existed in a world built of glass, steel, and distance. His penthouse overlooked a skyline that glittered obediently every night, yet he rarely noticed it. Wealth had given him control over markets, companies, and futures, but it had not taught him how to sit with himself. His mornings were structured, his meals precise, his schedule relentless. Assistants spoke for him when possible, and silence followed him wherever he went. People saw a billionaire. They didn't see the man who avoided mirrors too long, or the nights he stayed awake wondering why success felt like an unfinished sentence. His mother believed legacy was everything: name, reputation, bloodline. Timothy had learned early that affection was conditional and approval had a price. He paid it well, but it never satisfied the hunger underneath. Deborah spent her afternoons walking slowly beside her mother to the hospital when Ruth had the strength, counting the cracks in the sidewalk and inventing stories for each one. One day, while Ruth slept during treatment, Deborah sat in the hallway and watched people pass, doctors rushing, families whispering, strangers holding flowers. She noticed how flowers changed faces. People smiled differently when holding them. That was when she began to form her idea. Not fully, not yet, but the seed was planted. She asked a nurse what Valentine meant, and the nurse explained it was about love and showing someone they mattered. Deborah frowned, thinking hard, then nodded as if she had solved something important. That night, she told her mother about a hero called Val. Ruth smiled weakly and asked what a Val did. Deborah said, very seriously, that a Val helped someone you loved when you couldn't do it yourself. As Ruth's condition worsened, hospital bills multiplied, and hope became something Ruth rationed carefully. Deborah began saving without telling anyone. Coins from beneath couch cushions, small change left behind at stores, anything she could find. She hid them in a small tin under her bed. She also began collecting ideas about bravery, about asking for help, about grown-ups who might listen. She noticed a picture in a magazine at a grocery store checkout, A man in a suit, confident and composed, identified as Timothy Charles. She didn't know what a billionaire was, only that the article said he helped businesses grow. Grow was a good word. She liked that word. It meant things didn't have to stay small or sick. Timothy's evenings often ended in places filled with people, but empty of connection. One particular night, he sat alone at an exclusive restaurant, the kind where conversations stayed polite and laughter never grew too loud. He had come there out of habit, not hunger. Around him, couples toasted and servers moved like quiet shadows. He felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, the one that arrived when he allowed himself to be still. He didn't notice the small figure standing just inside the entrance at first. Deborah had never seen anything like the place before. The lights were soft, the air smelled expensive, and everyone looked like they belonged somewhere she did not. She clutched her 3 red roses tightly, her savings heavy in her pocket, her heart pounding so hard it scared her. She reminded herself of Ruth's smile and of what a Val was supposed to do. By the time Deborah reached Timothy's table, her legs were shaking, but she didn't turn back. She looked up at him, this man from the magazine who looked nothing like the hero in her head and yet somehow felt right. Timothy glanced down, surprised, ready to summon security, until he saw her eyes, serious, determined, afraid but unyielding. She spoke carefully, choosing each word like it mattered more than anything else she had ever said. She asked him if he could be her mother's Val, because her mother was very sick and didn't have anyone else. The restaurant seemed to pause around them, as if the moment had waited. Timothy felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity. Not obligation. Something closer to recognition, though he didn't yet know why. Without fully understanding what compelled him, Timothy stood. He ignored the whispers, the stares, the unspoken rules of his world. He listened as Deborah explained in her own words what a Val meant and why she needed one now. When she finished, she held out the roses with both hands, as if offering him a piece of herself. Timothy took them slowly, aware that whatever choice he made in that moment would alter something fundamental. He told her to show him where her mother was. Deborah exhaled for the first time since entering the room. She had done it. She had asked. And somewhere deep inside Timothy Charles, a door long sealed began to open, though neither of them yet understood where it would lead. Timothy Charles did not usually allow strangers into his personal space, let alone his life, yet he found himself walking beside Deborah Kelvin through the city streets as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The night air was cool, brushing against his tailored coat, while Deborah held tightly to his free hand, afraid that if she let go, the courage carrying her forward might vanish. She spoke as they walked, filling the silence with fragments of her world, how her mother liked tea without sugar, how hospitals smelled like worry, how being brave felt like standing on one foot for too long. Timothy listened more closely than he had listened to anyone in years. There was no calculation in his attention, no strategy. For once, he wasn't thinking about outcomes. He was simply present. With each step, the distance between his world and hers seemed to narrow, though he couldn't yet explain why that unsettled him so deeply. At the hospital entrance, the automatic door slid open with a quiet hiss, and the familiar scent of antiseptic wrapped around them. Deborah's pace quickened, urgency pulling her forward. Timothy noticed how people looked at them, some curious, some judgmental, some indifferent, but he ignored it all. Inside, Ruth Nathan lay resting, her body thin beneath the sheets, her breathing shallow but steady. She looked smaller than Deborah had described, as if illness had gently but persistently erased parts of her. Deborah rushed to her side, speaking softly, introducing Timothy with pride and hope tangled in her voice. Ruth opened her eyes slowly, expecting another nurse, another update she might not survive. Instead, she saw a man standing awkwardly near the bed, expensive suit out of place in the dim hospital room. Confusion flickered across her face, followed by polite restraint. She had learned not to expect kindness from strangers anymore. Timothy stepped closer, and that was when the feeling hit him, not all at once, but like a pressure building behind his eyes. Something about the room, the angle of the light, the quiet dignity with which Ruth endured her pain stirred memories he rarely allowed himself to touch. He watched her closely now, noticing the way her hands folded automatically, the way her gaze softened when she looked at Deborah. Then she spoke, thanking him for indulging a child's imagination, apologizing for the inconvenience. Her voice, though weakened, carried a familiar cadence. Timothy froze. The sound cut through years of noise and distraction, reaching a place he had sealed off for survival. His chest tightened, his breath catching as recognition clawed its way to the surface. He remembered standing on a bridge long ago, hollow and hopeless, and a nurse who had refused to walk past him. The memory didn't overwhelm him. It clarified him. Timothy saw it all with sudden, painful clarity, the cheap tea bought with someone else's last money, the calm words spoken to a stranger who looked like he had already given up, the quiet insistence that life could still change. He had never known her name then. He hadn't needed to. But now, standing in this hospital room, he knew. Ruth Nathan was a woman who had saved his life when he couldn't save himself. His composure cracked, just slightly, enough for Ruth to notice the shift. She studied his face more carefully, searching it, and slowly her own eyes widened with recognition. The room seemed to shrink around them, the present and the past colliding in a way neither had anticipated. Timothy did not hesitate after that. He didn't explain everything, didn't dramatize it. He simply acted. Within hours, arrangements were made, doctors consulted, specialists flown in, transfers approved without resistance. Ruth was moved to a facility equipped to give her a fighting chance, something she had been told repeatedly was impossible. Deborah watched it all unfold with awe, believing wholeheartedly that her Val had done exactly what a hero was meant to do. Ruth, overwhelmed and disoriented, struggled with guilt, with pride, with the fear of being a burden. Timothy reassured her quietly, firmly, making it clear this was not charity and not repayment. It was choice. For the first time since illness had entered her life, Ruth allowed herself to rest without fear. As days passed, healing began, not just in Ruth's body, but in the spaces between them. Timothy visited often, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes talking about nothing important at all. Deborah grew comfortable around him, correcting his posture, insisting he learn her favorite games, declaring him family without asking permission. Timothy found himself laughing, softly at first, then freely, startled each time by how natural it felt. Ruth watched this bond form with cautious gratitude, her heart torn between relief and vulnerability. She had built her life on self-reliance. Accepting love felt far more dangerous than accepting pain. Yet, with each passing day, she saw the truth she could no longer deny. Something rare and fragile was growing, rooted in kindness, courage, and the promise made by a child brave enough to ask. By the time Ruth's condition stabilized and hope became something more solid than a wish, Timothy understood that his life had already changed. Not because he was a billionaire, not because he could afford miracles, but because a little girl with 3 red roses had stepped into his world and refused to leave it unchanged. And though none of them knew it yet, the hardest test of that love was still waiting, quietly, patiently, just beyond the edge of their fragile happiness. Hope did not arrive all at once. It arrived in careful increments. Ruth Nathan's recovery was slow, deliberate, and uncertain enough to keep everyone cautious. Each morning brought new tests, new conversations with doctors who spoke in measured optimism, and new reminders that survival was not the same as safety. Timothy Charles immersed himself in the process with a quiet intensity that surprised even his own medical team. He learned the names of medications, memorized Ruth's vitals, and adjusted his schedule so no meeting ever outweighed her progress. It wasn't performative. He didn't announce it, didn't seek praise. He simply stayed. For Ruth, this constancy was both comforting and terrifying. She had lived long enough on her own to know that dependence could be dangerous. Yet Timothy never made her feel owned or indebted. When she tried to thank him, he stopped her gently, reminding her that some moments were not transactions but crossings, points where two lives intersected and changed direction together. Deborah thrived in the safety of routine and attention. She began attending a nearby school connected to the medical facility, quickly charming teachers with her curiosity and startling emotional intelligence. She spoke openly about her daddy Val, insisting the title was permanent even when Timothy tried to correct her. To Deborah, titles were chosen, not inherited. Timothy found himself rearranging parts of his world to accommodate hers, adding smaller chairs to rooms that had never needed them, learning how to braid hair badly but enthusiastically, listening to long stories that had no point other than being told. These moments softened him in ways no achievement ever had. Ruth watched this transformation with a growing mix of affection and fear. She saw the man behind the empire, saw the loneliness he carried quietly, and recognized a familiarity in it that mirrored her own past. Love crept in not through grand declarations but through shared exhaustion, unguarded laughter, and the mutual understanding of what it meant to survive when the odds said you shouldn't. As Ruth regained strength, the world Timothy had kept carefully compartmentalized began to push back. His mother, Eleanor Charles, arrived unannounced one afternoon, her presence immediately altering the atmosphere. She was composed, elegant, and unyielding, the kind of woman who believed control was love expressed correctly. Eleanor had built her life around legacy, and Timothy was its crown jewel. She assessed Ruth in a single glance, her smile polite but empty. Conversation remained civil on the surface, but tension ran beneath every word. Eleanor spoke of expectations, of appearances, of how compassion was admirable, but boundaries were necessary. Ruth sensed the judgment immediately. She had encountered it before, in subtler forms, looks that measured worth in education, wealth, and pedigree. Eleanor didn't raise her voice or insult her outright. She didn't need to. Her disapproval was precise, surgical, and devastatingly clear. The breaking point came quietly. Ruth overheard Eleanor speaking to Timothy in a private corridor, her tone sharp with certainty. She spoke of disgrace, of headlines, of how a woman from a hospital ward could never belong beside a man like him. She questioned Ruth's intentions, her background, her value. Timothy's response was firm but restrained. He defended Ruth without theatrics, believing reason could soften his mother's stance. Ruth heard enough. Each word landed heavier than the last, echoing old fears she had worked her entire life to silence. She thought of Deborah, bright, sensitive, absorbing everything around her, and imagined her growing up under the shadow of resentment and rejection. The idea broke something inside her. Love, Ruth decided, was not enough if it came at the cost of a child's sense of belonging. That night, Ruth made her choice. She packed quietly, efficiently, moving through the room like someone who had practiced leaving too many times before. Deborah slept through most of it, stirred only when Ruth lifted her gently and whispered reassurances she didn't fully understand. There was no note left behind, no explanation written down. Ruth believed explanations invited pursuit, and pursuit would only prolong the pain. She told herself Timothy would recover, he had everything, after all. She told herself Deborah would be safer growing up without learning that love could be conditional. As dawn broke, Ruth and Deborah slipped away to a small lodge far from the city's noise, carrying only what they could afford and the weight of a decision made out of love rather than fear. When Timothy returned and found the room empty, the silence hit him harder than any loss he had ever known. It wasn't the absence of people, it was the absence of meaning. For the first time in his life, wealth offered no solution, no immediate fix. He searched relentlessly, refusing to accept that they had simply vanished. And somewhere, in a quiet room with thin curtains and unfamiliar sounds, Deborah held her mother's phone, staring at the screen with determination well beyond her years. She missed her daddy Val. And unlike the adults around her, she believed love was something you ran toward, not away from. The lodge Ruth Nathan chose was modest and quiet, tucked away where travelers passed through without lingering. The walls were thin, the furniture worn smooth by years of use, but it was affordable, and most importantly, it was anonymous. Ruth believed anonymity was safety. Each morning she woke before Deborah, staring at the ceiling as the weight of her decision pressed down on her chest. She told herself she had done the right thing, that love sometimes required distance, that protecting a child meant accepting loneliness. Yet doubt followed her everywhere. Deborah tried to be brave, mimicking her mother's calm, but children were terrible liars when it came to longing. She missed the routine of the medical facility, the sense of security, and most of all, the man she had claimed as her own. At night, she whispered stories to herself about a Val who always found his way back, even when the road was dark. Timothy Charles unraveled quietly. He searched without spectacle, without press, without delegating the pain. For the first time in his life, money failed him. There were no records to trace, no assistants who could solve the problem faster. He replayed every conversation, every moment, wondering what he had missed. He blamed himself for believing love could exist without confrontation, for underestimating the damage his mother's words could cause. When days passed without answers, something inside him hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. He knew now what it meant to choose. Not between comfort and inconvenience, but between legacy and life. Still, without knowing where Ruth and Deborah were, choice felt like shouting into the void. Deborah made the decision on her own. One afternoon, while Ruth stepped outside to speak to the lodge manager, Deborah slipped the phone from her mother's bag. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through contacts she barely recognized until she found the name she wanted. She remembered the number by heart anyway. When Timothy answered, her voice broke through his despair like a lifeline. She didn't cry or beg. She simply told him where they were and said she missed him. The line went quiet for a moment, then Timothy promised he was coming. Deborah hung up feeling lighter than she had in days. Some promises, she believed, did not need proof. They carried their own truth. Timothy arrived just before nightfall. He didn't call ahead. He wanted to see them with his own eyes, to make sure they were real, that hope had not become another illusion. When Ruth opened the door and saw him standing there, all the strength she had gathered to leave collapsed at once. She tried to apologize, tried to explain, but Timothy stopped her gently. He spoke not of misunderstandings or forgiveness, but of certainty. He told her she was not a mistake, not a charity case, not a threat to his world. He told her Deborah was not an inconvenience but a gift. He told her love chosen freely was stronger than any bloodline. Ruth listened, tears blurring the lines she had drawn so carefully around her heart. For the first time since leaving, she allowed herself to believe she had not ruined everything. They returned together, not in secrecy, but with intention. Timothy confronted his mother without anger but without compromise. He made it clear that his life was not a negotiation and that love did not require approval to be real. Eleanor Charles did not yield easily, but she saw something in her son she had never seen before: peace. Whether she understood it or not, she stepped aside. Ruth resumed her recovery with renewed strength, no longer burdened by the fear of being unwanted. Deborah flourished openly, no longer guarding her joy. Timothy, for the first time, felt rooted in something that could not be taken from him. The adoption was quiet and private, exactly how Deborah wanted it. Timothy knelt in front of her and gave her a small ring, promising not perfection, but presents. Deborah accepted it solemnly, declaring the promise binding forever. The 3 red roses, once clutched in trembling hands, were preserved in a glass case in their home, untouched and eternal. They were not symbols of death or rescue, but of courage. Of a child who believed love could be asked for. Of a woman who survived because she once chose kindness. Of a man who learned that true wealth was found not in what he owned, but in who he chose to stand beside. And in that choice, a new beginning quietly, beautifully began. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.